saw this an extraordinary achievement so far to envisage this new neighbourhood, a neighbourhood which, well, it seems, you guys talk about exponential sustainability, about which at least the AJ quotes that, so I hope that's correct. Looking forward to understanding what that means. But there's so many kind of ethical underpinnings to the scheme, but on a purely visual level, it's just extraordinary to see something which felt like it belonged to the 18th century, a kind of romantic idea of how to live, a kind of, as if these were paintings made by Poussin. And so I thought it was terribly important for us to kind of hear about the project. So, Jonathan and Daniel and Mellis, thank you very much. They're each going to talk for a bit, and then in the spirit of dialogues, hopefully we'll have a conversation. So, you're all welcome, and thank you all very much.
God, it's hot in here, isn't it? Are you hot as well? Yeah, so I'm Jonathan. I'm a founder of Human Nature. And I've got the really boring bit this evening, and I think you'll agree with me by the end of it. It's my job is to define the sort of vision and what Simon referred to as exponential sustainability, the kind of why of this project. Dan, as always, our lead designer, has the best bit, because he gets to talk about this next time we do it, Dan. So this project's called the Phoenix. It's in Lewes, which is where I live. I'm doing this project out of self-respect, really, in that you live in a town like this, and you have an 8-hectare brownfield site that was the subject of a really banal development with a planning consent that turned out not to be economically viable, which was good news for us. A community group formed. It was called Phoenix Rising, and it sounds like an awful brand name, doesn't it, Phoenix? It sounds like, you've had sort of lowly paid brand consultants come up with a name, but it actually is the Phoenix Ironworks. So people think of Lewes, if you know it at all, as a sort of beautiful, picturesque South Downs historical town, almost a museum. Actually, it's a very lively place full of fascinating people. It was the home of Thomas Paine, so the rights of man. He was nearly imprisoned and killed for his beliefs. And Lewes has this kind of rambunctiousness about it, a sort of restlessness. It was home of the transition towns movement, along with Totnes, the Lewes Pound. It's Sussex University nearby, lots of radical left-wing intellectuals when it was still fashionable. I think they still think it is fashionable, by the way. But a place that didn't really have any industry, and this was where the industry was. It was full of life. It had a cement works, it had an iron foundry, a brewery, it had public housing. It was an extraordinary place, and then it was all pretty much bulldozed, and some lightweight sheds were put there. And there are still some very lovely historic structures that we're hoping to repurpose. So I've got 20 minutes. I've already taken about 5 and haven't said anything yet. So I'll get into this. You'll have heard much of this before, but the reason I'm going to underline this is because everyone talks about sustainability now. Everyone. What is it really? What does it need to be as expressed through place and as expressed through infrastructures, and then ultimately the behaviours that place can give rise to? And what's the agenda? How quickly do we need to move? And why is place important at this kind of scale in regards to that agenda? That's my topic. Good luck in 15 minutes. I'll see what I can do. So we're working on our new website. It's been a very cathartic experience, as it nearly always is, because I'm incredibly loquacious and verbose. And so to be disciplined by clever writers into thinking about what your mission is. And we got it down to this, actually. And it's this notion that a sustainable world will have to be a far, far better world. It's not just an environmentally sustainable vessel for misery. And unless we demonstrate that, unless we can show that living sustainably in sustainable places is joy and health and well-being and strong community and social interaction, the whole Maslowian hierarchy, unless we can demonstrate that it's a far, far better world, we've got no chance of moving at the speed that we need to. We won't inspire people to take collective action at the local level or politically. The problem with it is it has to be seen to be believed, because words are cheap now. The rhetoric around the future is so frayed, it's so worn thin. And one of the advantages of you guys, if I understand your backgrounds a little bit, is that you have the ability to create three-dimensional places and the spaces between them that in turn can create experiences. And if those experiences are incredibly positive and they're very human, then we can create from that relatable stories that we can tell to the world about what this far, far better future is. And so our role as developers, we're not really developers in a sense. We've taught ourselves how to do it and how to deal with the money and how to work with teams, but we're campaigners really, and our campaign is to show that there is this far, far better world out there. And let's show what we mean. Let's actually show and give people the experience of doing it, of living in that way. I'm going to move quite quickly through this. There's a bit of technocratic stuff, but these are the principles that underpin the way that we think about places. So the first one here is a place, that you probably can't see that at the back, but a place to start and a place to stay. This is Bruce Katz from the Brookings Institute talking about the critical significance of places that welcome people of all kinds into a neighbourhood and a community. The idea of a mixed tenure, mixed demographic, mixed income place, and a place where you can move, and as your circumstances change, either you have an adaptable building that will adapt to your changing circumstances, and if it can't be that, and it can't always, then a neighbourhood where if you want to stay, you'll find somewhere because there's lots of choice. The second is 2.3 tonnes of carbon, which sounds odd, but it's miles beyond net zero. So there are 8 billion people on the planet, or give or take, and if everyone emitted or gave rise through their behaviours and what was done in their name to 2.3 tonnes of carbon, we'd have a small chance of staying within 1.5 degrees of warming, which is still a very dangerous place to be. But that's what's called global fair shares carbon. Now, UK carbon footprint's about 12 tonnes. That's just what's generated, as it were, by our economy in the UK. And then we've got embodied carbon in all the things that we import from China, Indonesia, wherever, which takes us up to about 15 or 16 tonnes. Now, if we can build regenerative places, so we can actually build in a way that takes carbon from the atmosphere, that's a great start. If we can generate our energy from renewable sources, 100% of it, that's a fantastic thing to do. We're nowhere near it yet, but you can do it at a neighbourhood scale, actually. You still then got to have lots of behavioural change in regard to walking, cycling, consumption, particularly food, in terms of that's about a third of your environmental footprint. And so a place that brings people together, that creates a kind of culture of behaving differently. So we're not wagging our fingers at people saying, oh, you know, you're a bit like blaming people for being obese, as it were. You know, you've got a terrible carbon footprint, you have to change. Unfortunately, we've put you on the edge of a town where there are no buses. Your work is on the other side of town. You know what I'm saying. And so a place that can generate ideas about ways of living together through a shared economy and shared space to get towards 2.3 tonnes. Next is what we call radical affordability. So something like 90% of the new houses needed in this country need to be affordable. And you know, it's one of those words. What does that really mean? But in terms of providing housing for people on even ordinary incomes, but of course it's got to be much more than that. What about the rest of the cost of living? And so we have things like co-mobility services. So in a walkable neighbourhood for your everyday needs, you can walk and cycle, and you meet your neighbours, and you've got the local services that you need. Other than that, then you go through the whole transport modal hierarchy. But ultimately, if you've got co-mobility services to meet the needs when you have to drive, say, on those rare occasions when you'd absolutely have to drive, then you can save, the average household could save £3,500 a year. If you've got a super efficient building envelope, then you can save 80% on your energy bills. If you deal directly with farms to bring food to your neighbourhood, then you can save money on food bills. And that's what we mean by radical affordability. It's those networks and relationships across an entire lifestyle profile that you can deal with at the neighbourhood level that you can't at a building level, for instance. And I've talked about co-mobility services. This is a low parking in an urban neighbourhood, the walkable neighbourhood, and the space that's freed up by all the car parking spaces, of course, can be used for public space, can be used for greenery, can be used for more homes, to create the kind of gentle density, as the Office of Place calls it. That means that a scheme can be more economically viable, but it can also be much more social. You can have low traffic streets, you can have green streets. We've got an ageing population, so they're much safer for people to move around. So Lord Young used to talk about designing a city for children, and if you did that, it would be a great city. And so centralise your parking, as they do in Vauban, provide co-mobility services, so electric cargo bikes, other electric bikes. Lewes is very hilly. I've got an electric cargo bike from Denmark, and it won't go up the hills because it's a bit of an old one now. But the new ones do. They're really incredibly efficient. The future of urban mobility, I would suggest to you. And so a relatable story that I was talking about before would be, for instance, a granny on an electric cargo bike with her 2 grandchildren in the box on the front, collecting her shopping from the shop and grinning from ear to ear because she loves it. That's a far, far better future with a story told that will change the world, not another report on carbon and transport that will never get read, and anyway, the Tories will ignore it. So the power of lived example is extraordinary. Regenerative economy. So what do I mean by that? I mean that we need a much more productive economy in this country. One of the reasons we're so unproductive is that we don't have proper childcare. So I lived in Scandinavia for a number of years. Young people go back to work really quickly, and they're healthier and less stressed because you have free at the point of delivery childcare. It's things like that. It's investment in infrastructure that makes it easier to move around, better schools, better... So I didn't mean to make a political broadcast this evening. It's just weird, though, what the built environment
You've only got 5 minutes left.
can invite you to do. Anyway, I'll circulate this afterwards if anyone would like. This is our kind of DNA. These are the principles that we work on. Now I'm going to do the cheery bit. We're absolutely fucked. And we have to unfuck ourselves really, really quickly. I've been working in environmental and sustainability issues for nearly 40 years now. I was a director of Greenpeace in the 1980s. And we really thought in the 80s that we were winning. You know, we got the Montreal Protocol on CFCs. We launched our climate changing campaign in 1989. Some success, obviously, with that one. And it really is an existential crisis. People go, well, don't talk about the gloom and doom. But actually, if you don't, then we miss by a mile the type of actions, the strategic nature of the actions we need to take in every walk of life, in every part of the economy that is needed to get close to what we need to do. And we've got 8 years now So, and that's according to the IPCC. We've got to cut global carbon emissions by 50% in 8 years. Actually, 7.5. It's just not conceivable. So, and we think that actually action at the neighbourhood level with these relatable stories, creating these compelling experiences about the far, far better world, is the way to create a viral campaign that will lead to collective and political action. I don't believe it's going to be top-down anymore. I used to believe that, and I don't think it's going to happen. I think the power of joy in a neighbourhood, in an intrinsically sustainable neighbourhood, is the way to go. And, you know, it's not just climate. Sir Robert Watson unfortunately died recently. He was the government's chief scientist for a while, but he and many others regard the crisis in biodiversity to be at least as worrying as, this is the cheerful bit, by the way, as climate change, because of the, you know, the disease vectors, the way that we're removing, as it were, biodiversity and bacteria and habitats as we devastate habitats all over the world. And the UK is one of the worst offenders, of course. So Lewes is in the South Downs. You look at the biodiversity of the South Downs, it's not great, has to be said. The sixth great extinction, the Anthropocene. I always joke, this is me and Greenpeace in 1989. And it is a joke, it isn't actually me and Greenpeace in 1989. But the point is that the stuff we were saying then is all coming true. And I think we didn't really believe it ourselves then. We hoped it wasn't. We thought maybe it isn't really, but we're going to campaign just in case it is. Turns out it's all true, and actually much worse than we thought it was going to be. So recent science, climate science, is telling us that had we not got rid of CFCs through the Montreal Protocol, that we'd already have 2 degrees of warming higher than we've got now. The link between ozone and climate change. So I've already said this, so highway to climate hell. And Edward Wilson, the great American, he invented the word biodiversity. And he was the president of the American Academy of Sciences, and he'd be giving talks like this, but with many more people. And afterwards, politicians and economists would come up to him and they'd say, well, Professor, what a wonderful lecture, amazing. That was amazing, thank you, very moving. Unfortunately, we have to live in the real world. So he invented this phrase, the real world, the real world of science, and objective facts about, with decent doubt, as scientists have, but the reality, objectively, of what's happening, what we're doing to our planet today. So we're all bastards, basically, in the Northern Hemisphere, because actually our Tanzanians' carbon footprint is 0.01% of a British carbon footprint. And is it any wonder that they've swallowed the Western development model, hook, line and sinker, and if it isn't us, it's the Chinese, and it will be the Russians soon, in these African countries and other countries that are developing. We're undeveloping, as my wife says, Britain, she calls us an undeveloping country, whereas in Africa, they're following very much a Western energy-intensive model. And so we're not just, as it were, responsible for all the historic carbon emissions in the atmosphere, we're responsible for the economic and indeed development model that is going to make it much worse than it would otherwise be. Happy now? And this is interesting. This is Patrick Vallance, government's chief scientist today. And he said when he read the previous IPCC report that only transforming society, that's a scientist talking, is that the challenge is to transform society. So how do you do that? We think you can begin that. Well, not begin, but we think you can supercharge that through place at the neighbourhood scale. And so this is exponential sustainability. Does anyone know who John Elkington is? So he invented the triple bottom line of accounting. So environmental, social and economic accounting. He's ditched all that now. He says that was just messing about, really. Having seen the most recent science, and he speaks at events around the world and works with statured scientists of many different disciplines, he says that we need exponential sustainability. We need to go 10 times faster in every aspect of what we do, 10 times faster, if we're to have a chance of preserving the project of civilization, as he calls it. Greta Thunberg talks about cathedral thinking. You don't know exactly what it's going to be when you finish, but you've got to lay the foundations. You've got to start, because we're losing hope now. You need action is what creates hope. It doesn't exist in its own right. We're witless if we just have hope without action. So we've got to build a new world. We've got to build this, and I mean literally build a new world. We've got to regenerate places and infrastructures and streets and green spaces and make them regenerative for people and the environment everywhere. We can't picture this imagined future. So this is again back to my theme about how a neighbourhood can capture the imagination and provide this experiential component that's sadly missing. I'm going to jump through a lot of this stuff into this. So we all know this. Churchill, we shape our buildings and afterwards our buildings shape us. How much more true is that of whole places and neighbourhoods? So when you're designing a neighbourhood from scratch, if you ever are, or even regenerating an existing neighbourhood, you're dealing with pretty much everything. You've got streets, you've got greenery, you've got public space, you've got different kinds of housing, you've got businesses, you've got energy grids, you've got roofs. Which part of human life doesn't it touch? So the idea, now some people think of this as social engineering, as if that's inherently a bad thing, and as if actually building volume house builder estates on the edge of towns isn't social engineering. That's proper social engineering, actually, when you deprive people of local services and force them to drive, as it were. So very pro that idea. So how shall we live? What is this sustainable lifestyle? And Aldo Civic, the Italian architect, ran a series of workshops rather beautifully on rethinking happiness. And, some of these things tend to get a bit sort of rural idyll, we're all going to retreat to nature in some vaguely unspecified way and all grow our own food. But what's the urban equivalent where we can't be anti-urban? The urbanity, the urbanism is key to, it's human habitat for me. It's where our particular part of the ecology really exists. And then what's the relationship between town and the countryside around it in terms of food and all the other ecosystem services that it offers. So what is well-being and sustainable lifestyles? Well, it is walking, it's active living, it's social interaction. The biggest health problem in this country is what? Mental illness, depression. And what's the key way of addressing that is through creating a more neighbourly, civic, social place where lonely people who live alone, living in convivial communities, the whole Yang Gil stuff of all the different ways that people can have social interaction. I've got 2 minutes and I've barely begun. And we think, well, you can't, you can't do this. No one can ever do this. Well, that was Strogat in Copenhagen in the 1960s, and that's it today. Which is more joyous? Which is the cleaner air? Where's the more social interaction? Which is healthier? And that's Copenhagen today. That's just by Nyhavn. And it's just beautiful to see all these people out and about. And it's, it's not just fair weather cycling. And it isn't because they were born with longer legs. They probably were. But it's just, they just start gradually making it easier to cycle and redesigning their streets and their places, making it expensive to park. And eventually you get to a series of tipping points and now everyone goes, it's one of the best cities in the world. And it's just got that beautiful feeling as you move around of it being a human place. This is the system we use. We don't do ESG, environmental and social. We should really, because our investors like it. This is what we call our circle of impact, and these are the 12 levers that we reckon you can pull when you're designing or regenerating a neighbourhood. And if you pull them all at the same time, you get a compound exponential effect. I'm sorry, I haven't got the time to explain it, but it's all on our website. And so here is Dan's got all the nice stuff to show you, but I've just got one picture. And this is,
actually, I did say.
this is, we've got another little sort of catchphrase in human nature, which is like it, nick it. So there's almost nothing original in any of our work. I'm sorry about that. This is Jan Gehl's favourite urban block in the world. It's actually in Copenhagen, and we nicked it. It's all written up in Soft City by David Sims, and we've adapted it to Lewes, and it's a wonderful place for shared living. So these are 5-storey apartment blocks. You've got a children's play area, you've got a laundrette, you've got storage, you've got places for your camping gear, you've got greenhouses, you've got an orchard, you've got a barbecue area. The central area is a rain garden, by the way, because our site floods, so this deals with all the runoff from the adjacent hills. And it's a kind of hofje, like in an Amsterdam block. It's got this kind of circulation. And then everyone has a little bit of defensible space just by their front or back door. And it's just a beautiful way of achieving a sharing society in a really, really efficient urbane way. And there's a wonderful piece in the FT at the weekend about why British housing is more expensive than any other housing in Europe on average in relation to our incomes. And the answer is density. There's a whole series of wonderful charts in there. And it says that we haven't got used to living in apartments in the UK, and that we don't design apartments well, and therefore it's an incredible challenge for you to use the scarce, precious resource of land to create appropriate density with beautiful double aspect apartments and shared living. So the world is something that we make, and we could just as easily make it differently, so why don't we? Thank you very much.
Great. Hello everyone, Daniel Rea, Director of Periscope, lead designer. Apparently almost everything or nothing I do is original, so that's good, isn't it? Thanks very much for coming. Before I start, just thanks very much to Simon and Gavin for inviting us to do this super pleasurable thing to do. I hope, haven't done it yet, but nice to follow some interesting people. And I was asked to organise this, and I always put myself following Jonathan. So he says that I have all the nice stuff, but I have to follow him. But I suppose as he's kind of given you all the doom, I'm going to try and give you some joy. And I will try and do it in 12 minutes, because I would like the opportunity for you all to ask as many questions as we have time for. So, without further ado, for those of you that don't know where Lewes is, it's near Brighton. There's a grainy map on the right-hand side there, which shows it's the dot on the. I haven't got a cursor. It's the orange dot on the right-hand side, and it's in the South Downs National Park. South Downs National Park is the newest national park in the UK, formed in 2010. It has the dubious honour of managing to build 11 affordable homes in 2020. Slightly missed its housing target there, minor issue there. Keep that in mind when I talk about what we're proposing here. But the point about starting with this slide is that this is one of the most difficult planning regimes to build in the country. Think about trying to build 700 homes, which is what the Phoenix is, next to Lake Windermere in the Lake District, or in the middle of the Welsh countryside. It's as difficult to do in planning policy terms as that. So. And that's because planning policy relates to the park as a whole, the chalk landscape, the downland, rivers. This is the River Ouse, just south of our site, and the national park is the planning authority, and they look at the whole project through the lens of landscape-led ecosystem services, which is great, but we're building in a town, or trying to, in Lewes, and most people think of Lewes as the Museum of Lewes. This is Lewes Castle, built in approximately 1075. I think the Battle of Lewes 1246, which is commonly kind of when Lewes was founded. This is the sort of bucolic view of Lewes. It shouldn't ever be touched. It's very historic. It's got lots of listed buildings. It is very beautiful, but it is not only that. It's also industrial. It floods a lot. And this bottom image here is a photograph taken for the planning application. And this is quite a good photograph of Lewes in context. So you've got the South Downs rolling away in the distance. You've got an industrial estate in the foreground. The river snaking through the middle, you can't really see that. But our site for the Phoenix is right in the middle of that view. There's a white building about 3/4 of the way to the right in centre of the view, which is on the Phoenix site. And then stepping up the hill is the historic town centre. So it's very varied, and speaking to that is one of the challenges of the project. That's the high street. It's got plot widths down to 3.8 metres, for those of you that care about these sort of things. I do. It's super fine-grained, almost no national multiples in there, full of, as Jonathan said, sort of left-wing hippies selling really interesting things quite expensively. It's also the least diverse place you can imagine, 94.6% white British in the last sentence. But anyway, we won't dwell on that. So here's the site. If you can see the orange outline there, and the high street on the left-hand image there is snaking through the middle of that image. And we're about 2-3 minutes walk from the north of the high street. And then on the right-hand side is the site taken. That's a Sensat image, 3D digital image of the project. So the River Ouse runs past it on the right-hand side. There's a load of former industrial buildings, some of which are in use, some of which aren't. The road that's to the bottom, I'm going to call it a road, not street, because it's very fast and it's the only way into the town from the east, really. There are only 2 bridges in the town centre. That's one of them, and people drive across it at 50 miles an hour. It's not great. Severs the site from the town centre. And then you can see that greeny coloured rectangle there, which is the Pell's Pool, which is one of the first, if not the first, Lidos in the country. So interesting context. This is the Phoenix Ironworks that was on site before now, obviously. Jonathan mentioned it previously. Founded by a man called John Every. They made trams from Mumbai. They made bits of Brighton Pier. They made, like most foundries, ironworks all across the southeast, bits of drainage infrastructure. But there are 2 buildings left on site, which we're going to retain. I'll come on to that in a minute. This is in 2000. That's the site flooded. And that is kind of the catalyst for what the site's become today, which is quite derelict and empty. A lot of the businesses that are using the former industrial buildings moved out as a result of this, and they didn't come back. Artists came in, low rent, damaged buildings. The site changed hands a number of times, and then it came to human nature. So fast forward 15, 16, 17 years to 2019, 2020, and you get human nature's involvement. Before human nature, there was this scheme. It's a thing of beauty. Regardless of what you think of the architecture, it proposed a massive road into the town centre and built half the site on a multi-storey car park. This is important context for the project I'm about to show you. I'm not just dissing other people's schemes. The important point about this is that the whole of the left-hand side of the scheme is on a basement car park. And those of you that are into development economics will realise that building 2, 3 and 4-storey buildings on a basement car park is not super good for your business case, so that wasn't viable. So here we are today. Here are the edges of the site. So it looks like the right-hand side of the views from the river. It's quite bucolic, some might say. And then the left-hand side are the town-facing edges. This is this horrendous road on the right-hand side, which is very difficult to cross. And the top image is one of the sort of interfaces with the historic core of the town. And this is what it looks like on site. So there's one of the heritage structures on the top left. Then there's what we call foundry yards, which is the main yard between the 2 retained heritage structures, or proposed to be retained, on the top right. This is the current fire station in this image here, and the former one with Corporation Villas, and then that is an interior shot. So dilapidated with a capital D. And so I'm going quickly with sincere apologies, because that's seemingly important to do that. I want to get on to dialogues. I just want to talk about master planning. There are lots of people involved in this project. So Jonathan and his team became involved when they bought the site in 2020. It took a while for the legals to get going. Their internal design team did some sketching. We had a workshop phase when more people came involved in early 2021. Lots of people, Ash Sakula, May, Archio, Mellis is here, and Kyle, material cultures were involved. I'm not going to name check everyone because I'll forget them, but everybody had a go, and then we put all that together, and we fell out Periscope with Human Nature and Arup as the kind of core team who pulled the master plan together, and then we iterated through it for a year with the South Downs National Park Authority from early 2021 to early 2022, and then we did a bit more resolution on it, and then we decided to put in a detailed application, which we spent a whole evening talking about. That was Ash Sackula's phase 1, which is in the top of the site. But all this is to say it's been a very collaborative process, and it's master planning because it's going to be ongoing, and Human Nature are already revisiting components of it, even though we haven't got a consent yet. Important point for me that. This is something you'll all get, being as you work in this part of the world, but there are lots of constraints. I've just been through 10 slides of them. And Human Nature have lots of principles. It's what Jonathan spent 25 minutes talking about. I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. Do I remind me later? That sounds bad. Okay. I'm not a Mac person, which is not good. Oh, I've done it. Okay, good. And then we got to, so we combined effectively constraints, which are obviously what are the challenges, flooding, etc., principles, which are the Human Nature approaches, and came up with a series of key moves, some of which are here. These are all related to getting the density right, walkable streets, material sourcing. You've heard a lot about it being constructed in timber. We can talk a bit more about that later. And then all of the 5-minute neighbourhood principles, which I'll come on to. But there are a whole series of these which underpin the project, and you can find them all in the scheme, which is here. So this is the proposal, and effectively what happens is we retain the existing street network, and then which is the one that runs up the centre of the plan and off to the right from about 2/3 of the way down the scheme. And then there are 2 large courtyard buildings on the river, a series of C-shaped blocks which face southwest that face the Pell Pool, which is the one I showed on the aerial earlier. And then we deal with vehicle movement by putting a co-mobility hub. I wish I could point at this. Maybe I've got a pointer there. That's a co-mobility hub which captures all the traffic that comes off that busy road and directs it into effectively a combined parking structure with EV hire, EV bike hire, last mile delivery services, and a car maintenance and EV maintenance facility. And that stops cars coming into the scheme and Amazon person. And that allows us to build more densely and not have any on-plot parking. And then in the centre, where you can see all the coloured ground floors, that has a series of mixed uses, which I'll take you through in a minute. And we're also, obviously, connectivity is a key point of this project. So connectivity into the town centre, but also a new bridge over the river in the centre of the site. I'll show you that in a minute as well. So I start with connectivity, and I'll go quickly because I've given myself only another 3 minutes to do this. But so we have the Pells, which I talked about, which is where the pool is, but the Pells is also the water meadows to the west of the site, and the site sits effectively between the riverine sort of rural context and the town centre. So it's stitching that back into the kind of urban context. It doesn't really exist in the minds of people of Lewes. My aunt lives in Lewes. I didn't actually know this until we started working on the project. I never see her because I go to Lewes and do 9 hours of meetings and then come back to London, but yeah, hey ho. People just don't know where this is, and it's 2 minutes walk away from the town centre. So putting this bridge in and connecting it back to the town centre is kind of the important move. And then accessing the waterfront. You can't access the waterfront on the site at all at the moment, and we're proposing to complete that link so you can walk from communities that surround the town along the entire length of the Phoenix project and into the town centre on the waterfront. It's a big public gift, and it's very important. So retaining the red streets as the principal movement routes, slightly tweaking North Street, which is the one that runs up the centre, and then adding more fidelity, so secondary and tertiary streets, capturing cars in the co-mobility hub, and then introducing this cycle route that runs through the centre of the site and over the bridge. So it's all about kind of effectively taking the backbone of the existing site, not remaking that because it's super carbon intensive and cost intensive, and then just adding fidelity to it. This is the edge facing the town. So I showed you a picture of the busy road before. On this now, we'll have a cycle route. There'll be a bike hub in this a bike workshop in this building. This building here is the co-mobility hub, and then behind is Adam Richards' residential building, which is on the riverfront. And this street is all about trying to humanise it and make a better entrance to Lewes. We have got to cut down some trees. I'm told that's not popular locally, and I have to go and fix it next week. So if I return, then I'll be successful. But we're also proposing a mixed modal interchange for buses outside the co-mobility hub too. So it's all about slowing down traffic and trying to make that a better street. This is the river, so providing a new river frontage for Lewes. This is Adam Richards' building in the centre of the CGI, some May buildings on the right and Sackler in the distance. But this new riverfront walk runs the whole way along. New waterfront defences built into the flood wall. The flood wall's built into the buildings, which means that that's something the Environment Agency doesn't normally let you do. You normally have to be 8 metres away. Boring technical point, but you lose a whole load of developable area if you do that. Whereas here we've got building integrated flood defences. We're working with Expedition Engineering on this. They've never been allowed to do this in the last 20 years of practice. So it's quite a good win for us because we've got a whole load of developable area back, and it means that people can live on the river, and we can introduce a riverfront walk. This is the centre, so on the left you've got an adaptive reuse building, which is the Every Hall. It's going to have a community canteen. On the right you've got workshops, and behind there's a hotel, residential development and event space, and then this riverfront walk coming along the front, improved biodiversity corridor along the front, and then a bridge coming across. We can come back to all of this in the dialogue. This is May's building on the waterfront, raised belvedere, so above the flood defence. Yard on the left, active public space, river on the right. So there's a huge number and type of housing sort of choice in the Phoenix. Something that's a challenge locally is that young people are being priced out of the market. There's nowhere to work, and housing is effectively outside of town or 4-bedroom terraced houses that cost over £1 million, and there are no apartments in the town centre. So we're going to have a whole range of everything from studios, co-living, right up to larger homes, but across the project. It's quite unusual for Lewes to do this. Most things that are being built are big and expensive. This is a range. Might sound like ABCs of development, but that's effectively what we're doing. And then the community offer around the centre of the project, it happens around this Foundry Yard, so there'll be a flood nightclub, don't tell the planners. On the right-hand side is the adaptive reuse Every Hall with the community canteen and co-working space. On the left is the Foundry Workshops, which is startup workspace. So the previous view, that one is standing on that high-level walkway there, looking left. 5-minute neighbourhood. We talked about everyone's against the 15-minute city now. Apparently that's fascist or something. So we've got a 5-minute neighbourhood. So trying not to break the town centre. We're recognising that we need to be complementary to that high street that's very vibrant, and we don't want to break it, but we also want people to have local amenities, so corner shop, space at the bottom of buildings to work from home. There's a new health hub that you park in the co-mobility hub and walk for 30 seconds, or park if you're an even accessible bay next door, and then a range of homes above and workspace in the distance. And this is the sort of new public realm. What I haven't talked about is sustainable urban drainage very much. The whole project is, we have to manage water quite carefully. You saw the picture of the flood earlier. That's river water, but we also have to deal with rainwater coming off the hill. So we've got a completely integrated, or will have a completely integrated SUDS network. None of it's underground, all of it's above ground. Our current target for achieving biodiversity net gain, according to some intelligent people in the environmental statement, is 39% biodiversity net gain for this project. We have a pretty poor baseline, but that's a pretty good number, 39%, given that the national requirement's only 10. So, and that's partly achieved through low traffic streets, which allow us no car parking or very low car parking on streets, so deliveries only, which allows us to do this integrated SUDS network and greener streets and have child-friendly, safe places to be. This is a bigger bit of flood attenuation, performing the same function. On the right is material cultures building, I think on the left too, but the idea of these is they're big, generous, playable spaces that have a high performance, so they do a number of things. And at this end of the site, it's the northern end of the site, the riparian character of the adjacent Pels floodplain kind of comes into the project, and so we're in a more sort of slightly bucolic context, so we respond to that through the landscape treatment too. So just to summarise, I've only done 17 minutes, not too bad. So 700 homes, 3 community buildings, 50 electric car hire and car club vehicles, and 6 new public spaces. We've got a new health centre, quite an expensive flood defence scheme, new cafes, lots of construction jobs. We haven't talked about that, and we can do in the dialogue, but the construction strategy involves some off-site and some on-site modular construction. 100% renewable energy via some off-site PV provision, on-site PV provision, and then boreholes, new public gardens, and then a lot of new permanent jobs, and 9 Twittons. Twittons are important in this. There we are. Anyway, that's it from me. Very whistle stop, but I'm going to hand over to Mellis.
Dan, can you give me like a 2-minute warning of maybe
Yes.
a 10-minute talk? Because I think we'll, thanks so much. My name's Mellis, Haward. I'm a director at Archio. After everything that's gone before, I'm pretty humbled to be picked out of the plethora of extraordinary architects to talk about our plot. And maybe I can bring it down to plot scale and human scale. But the first thing I want to say is that we are working on a co-housing scheme on the Phoenix. And co-housing is really fundamental to everything that Jonathan and Dan have talked about. Because we've talked about creating sustainable communities that work together. And we've talked about a spirit of sharing, shared living, etc. And I think it's really fundamental. You talked earlier, Jonathan, about a third of our carbon footprint is to do with, for instance, our food consumption. And I think doing that alone is impossible, but, you know, precedents for co-housing across the other side of the water, it's possible. And I think just a little bit of backstory on co-housing. There's so many co's, co-living, co-housing, co-design, etc. Co-housing is where people have their own home, but they share facilities, etc., between each other. So we at Archio, and lots of my team are here, are really passionate about co-housing as a type of housing that facilitates a really sustainable relationship with your neighbours, a neighbourliness, another way of living. We're big advocates for it and have been on trips across to Amsterdam, Brussels, Ghent with our students, really understanding what makes it thrive over there. We also did a report for Transport for London looking at co-housing and more density and shared resources in kind of key transport nodes, and are working on co-housing projects for town, etc. So when Jonathan said, "Hi, up-and-coming young practice, would you like to work on this small co-housing site in this extraordinary vision?" we were like, "What? Really? How fascinating!" And then what you did was say, "But collaborate with us during the first stages." And these are just some screen grabs. I went through, you know, meetings, and it was just an extraordinary process. And I just think you should all know that this has been a unique experience. You know, being allowed in as a plot architect to talk about the master plan before you were even determined a plot was truly generous. And I just think it made for what you've created, which is a really dynamic, really spirit-catching, extraordinary place. So I'm grateful for the experience, and I just wanted to give a sense of that there. So here's the site. The plot that we were allocated after this experience was in the centre, on the 2 streets that Daniel described. And it's in the centre of the scheme, and I think, again, that's really in the spirit of the scheme, that a large co-housing building is like setting the tone in the middle of this place. It's setting the tone for shared living, for people, because in a way shared living occupies the whole of the site, but not all of the homes are co-housing or co-living. So hopefully this building will set the tone for what that's all about. We're interested in co-housing and how it translates into architecture. And here are some examples of some great co-housing schemes: courtyards, towers, kind of street-based. And the one that Jonathan and Archio, we talked about quite a lot, was this one called Brutopia, where they are 2-block infills that relate across the central garden. And there's a kind of looseness to the central garden that's really important in co-housing, so that you aren't defining what people are doing, but you're allowing a looseness and people to live their lives and create their intentional communities together. So we take everything that you've set out in your brief and everything that we know about co-housing, and then we say, but what about Lewes? How can we create a place that draws on Lewes's extraordinarily inventive character and make something that feels... In fact, earlier when you said, Simon, oh, somewhere that belongs, I thought we were going to say to Lewes, you said to the 17th century, but we wanted to create somewhere that belongs To Lewes, because of the complexity of the place, we want it to be loved by people there and to be picking up on that extraordinary character. There's a particular tightness to Lewes that's really extraordinary. These are just some pictures of the kind of small streets. And yes, it's quaint and it's kind of bucolic, but it also creates an intense relationship with your neighbours and the people you live with. And we really wanted to pick up on that. The kind of pavements spill on into the facades. There's a depth to that. And then crucially, you talked about your bike breaking down up the hills. It's a really hilly place, but the site itself is very flat. So how do you take the context of Lewes and its wild topography and make somewhere feel Lewesian whilst being a flat place? And we really thought that these articulation of the hillside, the stacked pavements, particularly that picture on the right where you have a front door on the ground floor and then 1.5 stories up you have the front doors of other homes. We felt like this was something that we could pick up on in the emerging designs. So with all those things in the back of our mind and with knowing that we wanted co-housing to feel like a little chunk of town, a little bit of a neighbourhood, we picked up on these in the design. So the scheme is a courtyard scheme, and it's co-housing in its entirety with its kind of affordability, intergenerational, etc., still to be defined. But one of the key things about co-housing and how it translates to architecture is that it's not the classic route from street to front door. You want to actually meet people on the way. You want to interact rather than kind of be isolated. So we saw that this kind of precedent of stacked walkways and balconies could be used in the way that you get to your home. So rather than created like, stacked deck access, create the stacking in that way. And we're doing the same, it feels ridiculous to talk about this now, but we're doing the same in Norwich, where we're using the walkways as the balconies, so people don't necessarily have their own private balconies, because where people join a co-housing community, they're looking for more interaction, to be with their neighbours more often, so you can have what we call an over walkway. Talked earlier, Dan, about the roofscapes of Lewes, and I think it's really important that we acknowledge that this site is often seen from above, so we want to articulate the roofscapes of the place. And we termed this flying maisonettes because you can see in Lewes, particularly because of the changing topography, you get these 2-story houses on top of higher walkways. So we picked up on that on the roofscape of our building. I guess it's also about creating a gentle density, a higher density in a place, and making that something that people will enjoy, and that there's a kind of sense about the character of the place has to be picked up in while creating density. And in terms of the landscape, coming back to the Brutopia example, loose planted meadows, occupied gaps and parklets, and picking up on the use of the roofscapes, looking at community sheds, etc. And then taking it to the ground floor, we're really picking up on the walk-in facades that we found on the kind of access through to the ground floor shared uses. So it's creating hopefully a kind of stacked neighbourhood. It's taller and it's picking up on bits of Lewes, purposefully creating somewhere where people will find their own place within it, and that it has a Lewesian character. But that within inside it's very overlooked internally, it's very interactive with the neighbours. So that's the architecture. Then we talk about what are people doing there? How is it co-housing? So classically in co-housing, you talk about having a common room where you share your meals and you eat together. But I think we felt that we couldn't just define what that brief was. We couldn't just say, oh, and then you're going to have a laundrette and this, that, and the other. We looked at case studies like what kind of uses are at Brutopia, and Jonathan and his team came with, a plethora of ideas. But at Archio, we really embraced co-design in order to co-brief projects and to work with people. But we didn't know who to work with because there wasn't as yet a co-housing community to work with. So we had the opportunity of this. You haven't mentioned, there's so much they haven't mentioned because there's so much they've done. There was a 3-day festival a couple of years ago where the entirety of Lewes came and shared their opinion about this scheme. And we used that opportunity to ask, how far can we take these shared living principles? We held workshops with local people and asked them the question, sort of posed to them, how shall we live? And how could you live together? What things would you enjoy from a co-housing scheme? Help us to find the brief for this. Because the other thing about co-housing is it shouldn't just be designed independently, isolated from the people who live there. It's supposed to be a participatory design process. And I have never met a more informed audience than the people of Lewes, who all already are in a co-housing group, know who their best friend is. There's one up the road, have you not been there? It was pretty humbling. But what was also extraordinary is that when we asked, what things do you want? That's not what they wanted. They wanted the opportunity to share food, childcare, healthcare. What they were looking for was the benefits of it, not the things. And it was an extraordinary kind of meeting of minds between what human nature were asking and what Lewes wanted. And it really felt like a synthesis. And just to say, my last slide is just to say how extraordinary through that workshop process, Sussex Community Housing Hub have taken on this whole group, working towards a co-housing scheme. And here they are, joyously talking about legal options. But I just thought to say that the brief doesn't stop there, and you talked about the next phase of the master plan, and I'm encouraged to know that we already have people to work on to define the brief of the next stage of this co-housing project. That was quite
You three should find a seat and sit down. 1, 2, 3 is amazing. I think you're kind of working backwards. What's interesting is the co-housing scheme at the heart of the community. Something that seemed so idealistic and in a sense so unrealistic, becoming so real at the heart of a new community. In a master plan which is kind of incredibly rich and integrating existing buildings and situated so specifically in its context, I can't really do what you've all said justice. And then that being founded on a profoundly ethical attitude to development, which is so outrageously rare. So, I mean, that is really brilliant. I mean, it's fascinating to hear. I think there are probably lots of words in there that a lot of us have all said and heard and shared. In some respects, the point about it not being a whole load of original ideas is true, but what it is a synthesis of things and the realization of things which a lot of us have either managed to do in small ways or otherwise dreamt about. So I mean, that's the power of it, as you say, to change a way of life for enough people, for people to concentrate, for the politicians hopefully to take notice. And simply, I mean, it's a bit like the avant-garde, isn't it? You establish something that people are kind of jealous about. So I quite like that. So I guess that's the kind of root to success is, as you say, experience. It is ultimately experience. I mean, you talk a lot about metrics in a way, or Jonathan, you talked about the kind of visceral horror of what's coming. But actually, having said that, everything else, it's not lots of engineering kind of. It's not a sort of literal technical response. It seems to be, as you say, a joyous, ambitious, visual, visceral, palpable, engaging, participatory. I mean, this is some of the words that we use, but I think I can use them to describe, and there's some of the words you use, many of the words you use. So, I mean, hopefully it will get built, and then more things will get built like it. So, I'm not going to ask a question. That was just by way of a thank you.
Pretty good
It's for everybody else to have a conversation with you three as you're here.
Does anyone want to start?
Yeah.
Well, just to kick it off, I mean, it's an extraordinary project, and it's in an extraordinary place as well. And in many ways, where would you kind of start to do this, except in a place like Lewes that has a tradition of being kind of radical, many different ways, and it's an incredibly picturesque place. So it's got it's got everything going for it. But I suppose what I'm most interested in personally is how this is replicable, and going back to your DNA point, could it be done in Swindon or Basildon or any other place? And what is it that you would pick up out of this, apart from the extraordinary efforts and the amazing process and the great talent that you've assembled? What would you pick up out of it, to put down? Because if we're going to do this big project, then it's got to be done many times over by not just you and not just this group, but everyone. And so I would just, going back to your kind of DNA point, how would you extract the kind of 5 or 6 things about this that you could give to somebody else, say, and if you do these things, you'll be doing development well, you'll be doing places well.
Well, thank you. That's a really good question. I think what we think is part of the answer to that is you've already used 2 of the key words, good process and talent. And actually, there's a lot of talent in this project. There are 13 architects, 2 urban designers, engineers, all hand-picked, but in the sense that most of them we knew quite well. We produced a blueprint, as we call it. It's not really the right word, but 20 themes, and because we were doing the legals forever, it went on forever. And so we were getting a bit bored, and we had 3 architects, so I just said, just scour the world for the best precedents that you can find for each of these themes. Some of the themes were quite esoteric in a way. There's one called Open House. There's a magazine called Open House. It's rather wonderful. It's about how you create neighbourliness by inviting people around to your house for dinner. It's become a movement. So we thought, let's break bread together. How do you do that in the neighbourhood? So blueprint first, lots of research, lots of precedents. And what you find is places like Utopia or as I say, there's very little that's original. It is the synthesis. It's the genius loci of any place. So it's making sure you're mapping those constraints really rigorously and bringing the evidence together. It's what Mellis said in process terms about involving everyone. We call it rather pompously deep collaboration, which itself is ruthlessly nicked from Steve Jobs. That was the way the iPod was designed, is that you get everyone in the room. So, the marketing people, the brand people, the cost consultant, everyone's a master planner. And it's not that we're asking each individual to produce a master plan, but they can if they want. There were some truly awful ones, by the way. I can give you a list of names, but never to for a master planning exercise. But put them together and give them some rules, both the rules of constraints and the rules of the sort of principles that I was talking about at the beginning. And you're starting to get a framework plan emerging quite quickly. And then, as Dan said, breaking that up into block type street block plot for us is the approach to urban design. But what are your block typologies and what are your tenures? And what densities what feels appropriate in terms of densities and landscape visual impact assessment? So there are a lot of processes and methodologies, the selection of architects, the research, the evidence base. But then what it's become, weirdly, is like a kiss of parts, actually. So I talked about this. We call them the Gill blocks, these courtyard 5-storey blocks. We've now worked out with Urban and Greencore and Whitby Wood and TDO how to build them in engineered timber and with timber and hempcrete panels. So we've got a playbook for that. That makes that transferable. We now know not broadly, within parameters what they're likely to cost and how to build them practically. So from this and from the work we've been doing on our strategy, we've now got 4 place typologies that we as a company are aiming to deploy. We've got a new settlement project, but that's for another evening, which is to really outcompete the volume house builders. They can fuck off. There's a new typology coming in, which is 80% affordable. We call these new life neighbourhoods, so with the sort of IP of elements of Phoenix, mixed use urban blocks, which is the Gill block, and then what we call housing clusters, which is essentially houses on the edge of towns. So, for instance, we've just been approached by, Scotland's owned by about 5 people. One of them approached us and said, I've got planning consent on my land for some houses, but you know what, I want to grow the buildings, can we do that? And well, I have no idea, but let's go. And actually, he's got 2,000 acres of woodland, and he's got a quarry, and he's going to grow hemp, or getting a license for hemp. And so, actually, building houses on the edge of this town, as a form of co-living, actually, he's done his master plan all wrong. It's like a massive gardens and plots, and incredibly idiotic economically, because loads of roads everywhere, and all these cars, and actually, if you turn it into more of a kind of co-living settlement with far fewer roads, and you base everything around the shared commons in the middle. So that's a very incomplete response. But then, you know, the aim is, just as we've nicked all our ideas from everyone else, is any of this, if it's of any use, is available to anyone at any time.
Thank you for a fantastic presentation, a really inspiring project. I just wanted to ask about the co-housing, because it's typology I find really fascinating. What's the kind of tenure? And you mentioned in your presentation, I think, like a voluntary grouping or something along those lines. So how does that develop over time?
I think with the people who are interested, there's always been an aspiration that it was intergenerational, because we felt like that would deliver on the benefits that people wanted from the co-housing. And there'd be a mixture of tenure as well in terms of affordability and market rate. But I think the sort of point being that we're working with the group to determine it. What happened actually is that when we had a workshop about how do people want to live in co-housing, we had about like 10 different formed co-housing groups who've all been looking for land for 20 years in and around Lewes, who started to kind of get itchy about who might be. And I think you guys have done a really good job having an intermediary to form the group in a more, in a way that's fair and appropriate. Because, you know, to say, oh, across this site there might be 90 co-housing units is a sort of catnip to co-housing fans. You know, it's a ridiculous number considering there's so few co-housing developments in the UK. So it's being managed, and I think the point is that we will work with the group to take the design on and to work with human nature to take on the split of affordable, intergenerational, etc. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, because I'm completely aligned, and I like take this from a point of view of like I want this to work and I want this to be wonderful. I suppose you mentioned the demographics, and kind of Lewes is super homogenous, to put it in very nice terms. And I come from Sweden myself, and so Sweden, Denmark, a lot of the social welfare state kind of has historically relied on homogeneity, which I think in itself is a problem. And I wonder if with some of these co-housing things, if there's this kind of exclusionary element, and kind of how do we counteract that in terms of
exclusionary to who? Sorry.
Well, in terms of kind of forming a collective, and who gets to be part of that, and how do we open that up?
Maybe Jonathan, you can answer for that one. I think it's beyond my knowledge of how the group has gone so far. But I don't think that I can't see how it could be exclusionary. You mean in price, or?
Well, are you talking about the formation of the group because it's local and the existing cohort, if you like?
Yeah, exactly. And like, how do you enter that?
But what happened here was that, as you said, I think there were 7 existing groups, but we decided to make our own and invite anyone from any group to come together to an intermediary. So there's a kind of a process of that kind of pre-selection. And Lewes, we just had to work with what we had, as it were, in terms of people that came forward from the area. But that is a brand new group with new relationships forming, and they're now forming a company. There probably is a pretty good cross-section of age in there and income. There's a third affordable housing, by the way. So in that, designated classified form of affordable housing. So yeah, there's a reasonable blend. I know what you mean. And it will be very different in London, probably.
Hello, evening. impressive inspirational to say. One question in terms of homes, you mentioned, it was quite a surprise, you mentioned you lived in Denmark and people lived in apartments. People raised their families in apartments, and I lived in Halebrown road here, raising my family, small family in an apartment, and people think we're crazy that we're not moving out into zone 4. It's culture change and culture shock. So how have you addressed, you mentioned it, how have the size of apartments and homes addressed that? Are there 4-bedroom private homes, private flats to buy? Are there more than 61 meters squared, 2-bedroom, 3-person apartments where you can't have your washing up anywhere? You know, how are the homes addressing that cultural change?
Well, it's nearly all smallish apartments. When I say small, I don't mean, I just mean 1 and 2 bedrooms. Because that's the need, that's the group that's excluded in this, because they're all very expensive, small to large houses. There are almost no apartments in the whole of Lewes. And so when you've got empty nesters, you've got older people living alone, you've got young families, that's what the demand is. And so that really suited us because we wanted this slightly higher density. And so there isn't really room for townhouses on the site.
I meant actual apartments, larger apartments. So that, for example, for us, we want something bigger than 2-bed apartments. Yeah. We can't get a 4-bed apartment. The only option is to move.
There are a few 4. There are lots of 3. And they're very loose fit, they're very adaptable spaces. We have a principle called raw and craft. It's a bit like the naked house, but not quite there. We want to put most of the money into the fabric of the buildings and not into the finishes and fit out, which we think can be done with the people moving in. And so they can put stud walls in, they can create more rooms if they want. I don't think there are any studios, but there are very small 1-beds. Because that's sometimes what people can afford. And there are just incredibly ingenious ways of manipulating a small space to make it really livable and wonderful. Equally, there are top floor, 4-bedroom, double height loft apartments in there, which actually pay for all the cool stuff. Frankly.
Hi. Was there a development brief set by the local planners for the site, and do they agree with your assessment of need in the town for the 1 and 2-bedroom apartments, and are they seeking anything radically different from what you're proposing?
It's a very difficult question. I mean,
it's a really good relationship with the South Transaction Fund.
I don't know. I mean, Dan said it earlier. It's essentially a sort of rural authority, which is in love with, as it were, natural landscapes. I mean, very few of them are really natural anyway these days. But so here, when you've got something so much urbanity, it's from Mars, actually. So finding someone to have that conversation with has been very difficult. Fortunately, they have a pretty good design review panel, and some of those conversations have been really helpful and fruitful. So Graham Morrison, for instance, is on that, and that's been a good conversation with him. The policy is it's somewhere in the middle. You know, it's very British. It's the kind of model. It's not quite low density, but it's not sufficiently dense, and that's why the previous scheme, one of the reasons it failed, I think, it was really an investor-led project, that one, rather than someone that loved place or design or people. But it was also crushed, really, ultimately, by a sort of middle-of-the-road framing of policy, which is very often the case, I think, because we just haven't, outside of the cities. And obviously, London is an honourable exception, but not everywhere. But we just haven't learned how to do good streets with apartment blocks, I think. And so there's a real resistance to it, including within the community in Lewes, and there's a lot of suspicion of what they call modernism. It's so last century, as someone said. It's just this sense of, very conservative ideas across the piece. So it's been very challenging. It still is.
Yeah. sort of a vacuum in which you're trying to formulate something new. But presumably you've still got to achieve some of those investor ambitions. I mean, you've got to make it pay, haven't you? And so you must have got those sums in place.
Yeah, well, I mean, isn't that the irony? Where eco-flaky hippies, right? The big investors that have had it before couldn't make it work, so they don't understand urbanism. The eco-flaky hippies understand urbanism, therefore you can create a viable scheme. And because we're flaky eco-hippies, we taught ourselves development economics for 20 years. We work with CBRE, we have a brilliant cost consultant. But we're taking 14% profit if we get there. On this, which is something like 6% lower than what you'd expect. We beat Barclay Homes. You wouldn't want Barclay Homes here. In fact, their business development director lives in Lewes, and when we won, she came to thank me that we won rather than them, which we thought was interesting. So it is viable, but only if we take a big hit. That's to get 30% affordable housing. It's very hard to do because there's no subsidy of any kind.
Can you say a bit more about the site acquisition in terms of that then? So your model, sort of viability model, is a lower profit. So is that sort of who owned the site before to make that decision based on what you were proposing as a high level outline?
Well, so it was a South African investment fund that owned 70% of it. The district council owned the rest, 30%, pretty much 30%. And they had a sort of joint venture, an informal joint venture. So they've taken it all the way through planning without really properly testing the viability. It's amazing what happens in real world neoliberal capitalist development, by the way. And they couldn't make it work. They sat on it for 4 years. There was an amazing community movement called Phoenix Rising, which was 2,000 people marching down the high street. And what was wonderful about it, mostly artists, by the way, and amazing sort of theatrical types, you really wouldn't want them against you. But they didn't win because the scheme that they hated got planning. But when they couldn't make it work, it became obvious that the site was going to be sold. So they came and found us in Lewes. We just moved to Lewes, moved to Sweden almost straight away afterwards. But we kept a place there. And they said, we think it's going to come on the market. Would you join together with us to bid? And we were like, yeah, but you then have to quite quickly do what Roger Madden calls a whiteboard appraisal, and it's parameter-based appraisal. It's unlikely to be less than, and it certainly won't be higher than. Can you make it work within that? That's basically expedition on the civil engineering and the flooding. They come along and, and they walk it for a bit, and they do some studies, and they go, you're going to have to spend £1 million an acre doing X, Y, Z. We had a couple of capacity studies done to look at what we could do with appropriate density, which gave us 625 units, but a bit bigger than the ones we've got. And then the cost consultant would say, if you're building well, it will cost this, from which came a whiteboard appraisal, and we were £11 million off the Barclay number, so we had to find 11 million. That's when we took the profit hit, and we basically stayed up all night with 2 bottles of red wine and decided that we would do it.
It's kind of the motto of the project.
Only 2 bottles.
and it's scary. It's scary stuff. We don't have a pension fund behind us, or super serious money, but we have fantastic equity. We've got people that really believe in this model. And actually, tectonically, the world of finance is coming in this direction. It's kind of interesting. They've all written these very beautiful ESG policies, and if you read them, they make you cry. And now they're going, I haven't got any projects. I haven't got any projects that meet my ESG policies. So they're coming. We're starting to meet them. But it's not a slam dunk. This is hard stuff. It's really hard. It's hard to get planning, and it's hard to finance. But we're very promiscuous, and we like piecing different types of money together in one, a bit like urbanism, in a sense. You don't go with one pot of money. You go fishing for different types of money for different things, and so we're kept on the mainstream of it. We work with CBRE, and they have all their people who kind of go, don't do that, and we go, we probably will then. I don't mean to sound so perverse. It's like a benchmark, forever a sort of reference with what's normally done, and then what are we different? if we really are, do we really believe in this, and are we going to really do it? What will it really cost, and what do we think we can? And I have to say, it's a lot easier to do it economically in Lewes than it will be, coming back to your point, in other places. So on another big project that we're working on, which is the new settlement project, is the 80% affordable housing one, but that's a whole other story.
So Jonathan, here's a little question. So if you are successfully disrupting the delivery of housing and to create better housing, and by the sounds of the plans we build, I get the feeling you can do it at speed and scale, so we can make a real difference. Ever thought about tackling a high-speed railway?
Well, it's an amazing book. I don't know if you've seen it. It was one of the books of the year. So it's How to Deliver Big Projects. And it's rather wonderful, actually. It's got all these lovely, helpful checklists. But its big philosophy is think slow, act fast. And I love that. Because it took so long on the legals. That's what we had the privilege of with this project, is doing all that research elsewhere. So we had loads of time to really think for it to do anything. So that when we were ready to go, we sort of knew what we wanted, and we were quite quick to come to a framework plan, and that's super helpful. But I think once you've done that, I think we really have to get on with it, and I think building, there's a real virtue in getting on and moving really quickly. I talked about 8 years. Now clearly this isn't going to move the dial, but even these conversations change the way we think, don't they? Because we get a lot of people say to us, oh, well, you know, that's really ambitious, that's really hard. It's almost like we're waiting for you to fail. And I think the point is we can't let these things fail. We can't let these things fail. They have to happen. There's no choice now.
One of the great joys of travelling out of the city by suburban railways is the way you can look into back gardens and see how people have modified their homes over time, and no two are ever alike. And it seems to me that that's a sign of people who cherish their homes, cherish their neighbourhoods, and who have probably stuck around, so there's probably quite a strong community in those areas. And to me, the challenge of this kind of development is how do you build in that opportunity for future evolution. And I'm not talking about kind of a bracket moving partitions around and so on and so forth. I am talking about adding a conservatory or a building on the roof or whatever it is, because ultimately it seems to me that that might be the hallmark of a sustainable urban fabric which is evolving and developing and adapting itself. And I just wonder whether your scheme here had enough of that about it.
Well, I think it's a wonderful observation, Dick, and thank you. I think the challenge is to get the viabilities, and we kind of have to max out the parameters. So the actual adding on is going to be tricky. I think we're looking really at the internal spaces more. That's sort of designing envelopes that are really robust, that are intrinsically adaptable is where, in a way, most of the adaptation can happen. I think as well, the adaptation can happen here as the community involves, in terms of local governance and how they run their community canteens and their shared living. I think that's where it's going to be primarily. I think it's a lot easier with a new settlement, where one of the things that we're looking at with that project is what we're calling embodied planning, where you get planning for a bigger volume, but we build a smaller bit to begin with. And then people already have planning consents to build up a bit or out the back in the way you're describing. In this kind of urban condition where the economics are so precarious in a way, it's quite difficult to do. But I think it's a wonderful observation.
Can I just respond to Nick's point, actually? So, sorry, I'm sounding really shaky. So I feel like I'm in an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, because I was, my name's Isabel, I'm a failed house builder. But I was a co-founder of Have Housing, which you know, and we famously went bankrupt, doing lots of wonderful things like this. And in answer to your question, Dickon, and I know you were with me constantly, one of the problems about that, I mean, we kind of found that structurally and in design terms, was fairly straightforward to do houses where you could build up and you could build out. But the problem that we had is that local highways departments and planning departments and the kind of places you're trying to build and we were trying to build immediately say that you have to design the highways for the maximum possible number of bedrooms that you could end up with if everybody was to max out every possible thing, and that completely fucks up the density basically in the slums. So until we have a more enlightened approach to that and kind of a wider acceptance that car clubs and sustainable transport and additional bus routes and working from home or whatever it is can be fed in, I don't think we're going to get to that stage where it makes sense.
So everybody else who lives in Lewes will be able to take their particular interests to their local planning authority and get planning.
Kind of Lewes might be able to do it because actually
anywhere that's new will be able to do that.
Yeah, and the place where we really couldn't do it, and you won't be surprised, we built quite successfully in Stroud. She made some money in Stroud, funnily enough, but trying to do it in Hampshire villages and Swindon was less successful.
Do you think, as well, part of that problem was scale? Because I know the one in outside Winchester, Kingsworthy. I'm guessing that 50.
That was 50.
50 homes.
Yeah.
And when you get to the scale of 700,
completely.
Does it starts to have its own? I mean, it felt in a sense that you're building.
We were way. Well, if you haven't set the presentation and why we went bankrupt, we were way too ambitious. Absolutely. I mean, we tried to do ridiculous amounts of innovation for schemes that couldn't support it, and we were really naive on the finance front for sure. I'm going to look at it.
I mean, one of the answers there is you're to phase it in biteable chunks. You know, do it in smaller phases so that you keep control of the debt and the cash flow, deliver it in bits that have enough momentum to get you a bit of profit out of each phase so that you can get on, build it like that.
Yeah, well, that's a part of it. I mean, you've also got things like, there's a health hub here, which everything's called a hub these days, isn't it? But that's got a 40-year NHS rental covenant, so financing that is easy. There's one that delivers quite a lot of cash in a pre-sale. Actually, social housing is incredibly investable. So we want our own housing association. Our chairman is David Callans from Places for People Group, so he knows a bit about it. So, but people want to invest in it and own it, and there are some good people, and we're talking to a number of them. But yeah, it's in the phasing, but here you've got a lot of upfront expenditure on flood defences, the land's expensive, so you have to move quickly anyway. But anyway, look, the funding is coming together really well. Might we go bust? Who knows? It's not inconceivable. Do you still have to do it? Yes. And as I say, the industry has to find a way to do these things. And I'm a fundraiser now. I spend most of my time doing funding. And it's really important to get it right, and you've got to find the right people who are aligned. They often know what the answer is and you don't, so you've got to listen carefully to what they need and what they want, and you piece it together.
We have kind of knocked off the car parking point on this one, which helps because we've got a slightly more strategic approach to it, which is good, which means that there's a little more flexibility on plot density beyond, and the parameters and the design code do allow for a bit more modification beyond, so that there will be a bit of flex in that. Yeah, it's difficult if you can't do that momentarily. So in Lewes, for example, we're looking at all town centre parking. The mobility building has an element of public parking and private, which is going to flex over time, which accommodates that density range. So, we can only do that though because we're working with the county and Lewes District Council.
Really? And then Joe.
Can I ask what your timescales are, please? You've got planning outline planning consent. You're going for details, and then how does the next 20 years look?
We've got finishing about 6. So
it's a hybrid application, so it's detailed for phase 1, including a parcel of housing, beautiful designs by Ash Settler, which again collaborative design. So they're designed. The architect has equal status as the timber engineers and the cost consultant and the urban designer and landscape architect. It's a collaborative exercise, so that's detailed. the first phase will include one of the Gill blocks and two other blocks which are possibly shared ownership depending on a particular investor. The timber playbook, which is essentially a engineered timber exoskeleton and then timber hempcrete panels, is incredibly adaptable and standardised across the piece. So we can build quite quickly, and actually you need to, and you've sunk that much capital in your land and infrastructure, you've got to move quickly. And so we have a development board, which has about, everyone says you should have a development director, and I'm like, they'll die, because there are too many different projects, and they're too unusual. And so we've got, a bit like the deep collaboration, we have a board that just oversees the development plan, and different contracts for different parts of the project. The answer on the time, don't know, but we're assuming 7 years from planning. Now, when there's another global financial crash in about 3 weeks' time, that might slow us down, and if there isn't, we might speed up.
Starting, hopefully?
Well, we'd start in January next year, so the flood defences are designed in detail. There's a lovely construction access that means that the construction traffic has to go into town. It can come straight off the causeway into the site. The engineered timber arrives in New Haven on a boat. We've been looking to see whether we can come up the Ouse in it, and you can't very easily, sadly. So we've got a double handling that goes on. Store at Enslow, likely to be our partner. It's brilliant having one of the world's biggest timber companies as a partner. So don't just think of it as a supply chain, think of them as your partners. Because there are a lot of people that want to be involved in a project like this in a way. So they're much better at solving problems in the supply chain management, in delivery and costing than we are. So get them in your team.
So starting January, hopefully, and first homes going on sale when?
26, beginning of 26. But we're looking to pre-sell, obviously. And, economically, one of the obvious things about...
Yeah.
one of the obviously good things about co-housing is a pre-sale.
Yeah.
You've basically got 40 families who agreed to buy a house. That's cool. Affordable housing, a third of it, that's already gone. There's loads of families waiting for that, no problem. Shared ownership, loads of families waiting for that. We're only selling about 200 open market. And I'm counting here, I bet there's about 120. And I think the other thing that the real estate industry has not understood is modern marketing. They still have the saddles down, the greatest day in time. There's Mercedes with a car engine running outside a porta cabin with loads of big brochures. No one does that in any other industry anymore. And so, because this is a sort of a particular kind of thing, we obviously want to pick the low-hanging fruit in this with our first project and sell it to people who want to live in a place like this. We're not compelling everyone in Lewes to come and live in Mellis's co-housing board. You don't have to live there. So let's find the people, just a handful of people that really, really do want to live there. They've all got 20 friends and relatives, and they go, have you seen this fantastic place in Lewes? They become your salespeople. They're your marketing team. So it's all about brand and customer relationship marketing, and then lots of pre-sales. That makes your financing a lot easier. When you turn up at the bank and go, actually, I've already sold 400 things.
Joe. I wanted to ask about after you've built them. Are you going to own the place and manage it? For what?
Because the key part of our thing is this creating this or enabling this very active community and the move to 2.3 tonnes carbon and running the energy grid with our energy. We have an energy partner who pays for the energy grid, by the way, and we have a profit share in that. So you're going to divide the projects up into different bits. And the co-mobility services, which will be done with a big transport company, but again, we all have a significant stake in it. So our aim is, but this is subject to the type of investment that takes us through the next piece, would be to own as much of the affordable housing as we can, so that we would be the landlord. And we like the Swedish model, where even when we're selling apartments, that we retain, if we can, the freehold of the block, and we work with the people in local residents association, manage the block, and work with them and support them. So yeah, we do intend to stay involved.
And what about the roads and the parks?
Yeah, they won't be adopted because East Sussex Highways won't adopt a road that has sustainable urban drainage on it.
So will you put
We have to.
Yes. Well, it's much better if you do. You get much nicer roads than ones that are...
Yeah, and they're very expensive. I'm terrified of it. So the aim is, so there's a hotel on there which we also, one of our investors wants to own. That's a nice conversation. So it's a terrifying thing when you go to your board and you go, we've got this hotel thing, because you kind of, everyone thinks as soon as you're going to sell it, you get a hotel operator in. And we were like, well, who would it be? What is a exponentially sustainable hotel? What does it do? What's the restaurant like? Do you have events and festivals there? Do we have this kind of meeting there? Do we create a festival of sustainable living? That's the thinking. So who would operate that? And then the investor said, well, why don't we just own it? I'll pay for it. So we do have some very rich people in this.
Another question. I'm conscious it's 8:45. These guys have been on stage for an hour and 3/4 thereabouts. So if there's any more questions, last few now. Go on.
I'll be really brief. No, it was more just an observation in response to the kind of back extension and adaptability. I suppose in a way it's just what's really nice about this project is thinking about it at a neighbourhood scale, because I suppose the back extension is nice for the person living in it, but ultimately it sort of just slowly inflates everything, and then you end up in Lewes that already has an over-provision of large houses. So thinking about it through different types of tenures and at a neighbourhood scale might give that sense of longevity whilst allowing people to move up and down in scale. The estate across the road, the Fellows Court, was built in that way originally. It has lots of small apartments, lots of big apartments. People over the course of generations move around within a neighbourhood rather than necessarily have to adapt their own.
Yeah, that's that principle of place to start, place to stay, Bruce Gats's piece. I'm still with Dickon though, in the sense of, the awful thing is if you're a social tenant, or even if you're a private renter, you're not allowed to really do anything with your place. And that just feels wrong to me. It feels like you've already means tested them to get in there, and we have an incredibly unequal society with lots of poverty, which is the root problem. But given that, why do we have insult to injury? We don't allow people long leases and security of tenure and the ability to adapt their properties a bit. But as I say, it's very tight here in that sense. So also what you say is kind of true.
Anybody else? Okay, in which case, I guess hopefully this is kind of for the future. I'm nostalgic for the third quarter of the 20th century, when architecture served the welfare state and social democracy, and it feels to me like this is kind of a new paradigm. We're all searching for, I guess, a way of making sense of this question of sustainability, and I'm sure this isn't kind of a way unique, but it is an amazing lesson in the idea that we might just be on the cusp of seeing a new paradigm, which Mellis, Daniel, Jonathan, thank you very much.